Chapter 24. Only the Hunted. Betrayal is the only truth that sticks. Arthur Miller. That whore, Cooper fumed, as he stabbed into the hunk of meat he had taken off of a deer. It had been a perfect opportunity. The fool thing had just stood there in the clearing long enough for him to get a shot off, and it was a good shot at that. It had killed the creature instantly. "I'm going to kill her. Stick a knife right into that pregnant belly and—" Armando sat a few feet away from Cooper, saying nothing, his eyes on the small amount of food on his plate. There was plenty to be had, although it was a little stringy and not evenly cooked, but Cooper had only given him a small amount, commenting that the boy was useless and lucky he got anything at all. At the moment, he was back on the same old subject, his cuckolding. Mama had always made sure Armando had learned plenty, despite the lack of books. And Cooper had definitely been cuckolded by his wife and her new lover. Cooper still wasn't sure how she had done it, but whatever Delwyn had done, it was enough to get her appointed as leader in Cooper's place when her father suffered a series of convulsions 2 weeks prior. And right after that, she had announced she was pregnant with that idiot Heimdall's child. "I'll cut that little bastard out of her and shove it down her throat." Armando let Cooper's curses wash over him. He chewed on a hunk of venison. It was dry, tasteless, and Armando remembered with longing his mother's cooking. They were never given much, despite her being the camp doctor, but what she made with those scraps of food and the wild edibles she taught him to collect for her was a feast compared to this. He took another bite, forced it down, and thought of her face and her words. "Eat, Armando. Eat and be strong. It is fuel, and you cannot stay strong without it." How many times had she said that to him? How many times had he nodded obediently and eaten whatever was on his plate? He knew, too, that Cooper would just as soon not feed him. The older man only kept him around because he was small and could fit into tight spaces. A couple of days ago, that had come in handy. Cooper had ordered him to find out what lay within a small shed on the outskirts of a farm. It had been difficult, but he had managed to squeeze through between the bottom of the shed wall and the dirt floor beneath. There had been grain, some farming equipment, and several knives, including one tiny and one half buried in the dirt. Without really thinking about it, Armando had slipped one of them into his pocket. It was a small Swiss Army type, just one blade and a space for a toothpick, although the toothpick was no longer there, and a small screwdriver as well. He wondered how he could get away from Cooper. Armando was nearly 9, and he'd had to be rather self-sufficient, but making ends meet in the middle of Tennessee was frightening, especially since anyone he encountered was either shooting at them or dead or dying from Cooper shooting them first. Cooper didn't seem to have any other setting. Killing seemed to be his primary way of dealing with people. "Choke on the blood, you damned whore." Cooper was still going. Armando's thoughts turned to the knife in his pocket. How he wished he had the strength to end this terrible man's life. The tiny, dull knife certainly wouldn't do it, and he was no killer. The fact that he was here, in the middle of nowhere, hungry and cold, was Cooper's doing. The boy hadn't exactly been welcome there in the neo-Nazi camp, but when Delwyn turned her sights on him, declaring Armando to be Cooper's illegitimate son, the rest of the camp had been happy to see the back end of him, along with this monster. Armando missed Sully, his only real friend. She had stood silent, tears streaming down her face as he and Cooper had been thrown out of the AR camp. Cooper had been so angry, so furious at everyone, that Armando had wondered just how long it would take before Cooper turned on him. How long before he too was dead by Cooper's hand. The man might be his father, but he didn't give a damn about him insofar as he could use him to serve his own needs. The last of the light disappeared from the horizon. The nights were dark, even more so than the America Reborn camp had been. In the last 2 years, the camp had cobbled together a small system of electric lights that ran off of a series of solar panels they had acquired during a trade or raid. Armando wasn't sure which. The light from the campfire gave off a dark red glow, and Armando knew better than to add any fuel to the fire. They hid in the shadows, traveling mainly at dusk and dawn, and slept during the day. Cooper was still ranting, although it had grown quieter, and Armando pulled his knees up, lowering his head and hoping the man didn't turn his rage onto him. The swelling from Cooper's last fit of rage was finally going down, although his cheek remained mottled in yellow and red bruises. All that Armando could think of as he slipped into a doze was that he wished his mom was still alive, even if it meant being back at the AR camp. Anything but this. The next morning found them on the outskirts of a small town. It was early still, barely light out, and there were no signs of activity. Everyone in town was still sleeping. They edged around the town, Cooper muttering quietly to himself as he scoped out the town's defenses. Sentries, at least one there at the end of the street, another up in that high hide in the south. Burned vehicles with skeletons. Nice touch. He rambled mainly to himself, noting the defenses before turning his attention on Armando. You'll go in there, tell him you're an orphan, ask him for food. I'll watch from here, and come tonight you'll let me in so I get what I need. He nodded, narrowed his eyes. I've been to this shithole before. They grow some nice tail around here. He stared at Armando. You do what I say, or I promise you'll be sorry you were ever born. I'll come at midnight. He gave the boy a rough shove toward the small town. As Armando walked toward the town, the boy thought about the past few weeks. 3 times now Cooper had sent him into farmhouses, isolated, alone. 3 times the boy had done what Cooper demanded. He'd convinced an old farmer he was all alone, then 2 men, a father and his grown son, and finally a young couple who had just lost a child to a fever. The last one, that had been the worst. He didn't want to think about what Cooper had done to the woman. He had hid in an outbuilding after being tasked to remove the husband's body and the bloodstains from the front porch, just in case someone came by. Afterwards, he had hid in the shed several 100 feet away and tried desperately to not hear the woman's screams. When they had gotten back on the road several days later, well outfitted now with a rifle and plenty of ammo, Armando had thought about what Mama would have said to him. At the camp, she'd always kept him out of sight of most of the more militant ones. His skin was dark, not as dark as hers, but still darker than acceptable when surrounded by racist white men. The neo-Nazis hadn't been eager to include him in their fighting lessons, other than to use him as a punching bag. 1 or 2 of those sessions had taught him to lay low. But here, with Cooper, there was no laying low. Mama would have stopped them, threatened them by saying she wouldn't patch them up if they kept going. But Mama was dead, and he was all alone. As he put distance between him and where Cooper was hiding, a set of high-powered binoculars in his hands watching his every move, Armando realized he had to make a decision. He thought of what his mother would have said, would have thought, If she had known that he had had a part in the deaths of 5 innocent people, she would have been horrified, and she would have reminded him that God would judge him most severely for what he had done. Part of him wanted to wail and cry, to hide his head in her lap and beg her to help him. He was so very lost without her. As the town drew near, he heard a sentry ring a bell. They had seen him. Soon he would have to tell the lie, how he had been orphaned, that he was all alone. The shame he felt at his part in the old farmer, the 2 men, or the young couple. It felt like a lead weight in his heart, and his steps slowed. "Reverend." Jeremy Deeds looked up from the sermon he was preparing to honor Mr. Lyles, and saw Joseph Perdue standing in his office. According to the town records, the ancient man had died just 3 days short of his 116th birthday. He had been so involved writing down notes for the sermon, he hadn't even heard the teenager come in. "Reverend, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation down near the Trade Mart. Some kid just walked in on the main road." Jeremy gave Joseph a befuddled look. Kids and plenty of other people had been making their way into town for years now, and for the most part things went peacefully. Either way, they had never needed him involved. "The kid is asking for a priest, so Wes sent me to get you." "Is the boy ill?" Jeremy asked. "Not that I can see, sir, although he's got plenty of bruises on his face and arms. He just won't say anything past that he needs to speak with a priest and confess his sins." Joseph shrugged, and he looked scared. Jeremy stood up painfully. His badly damaged leg, nearly pulverized in a car crash over 9 years ago, would always give him terrible pain. During the winters, when he felt every step even more keenly, the congregation had grown used to seeing him give sermons from a tall chair. It was hell getting into it, but once he did, he was good for the entire service. Joseph stepped forward to offer his assistance. Jeremy had learned to accept others' help, and he leaned on the young man and slowly walked to the door of the church, where a small crowd was gathering, the boy at their center. The boy was thin, painfully so, with large brown eyes and jet-black hair. His skin was tanned, and Jeremy could see the remains of several bruises on his face and arms. He was dressed in a ragged t-shirt and worn blue jeans that had patches. His feet were bare. The boy stared back at Jeremy. "You don't look like a priest." "And what do priests look like?" Jeremy asked in return. The boy shrugged his thin shoulders. "I don't know. I never saw one. Mama said they had funny little collars and they lived in the church." Jeremy nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, I do have a funny little collar I wear on Sundays, and I do live here in the church. My faith may be different from your mama's, but in the end we believe in the same thing. Will that do?" The boy nodded solemnly. "I must confess my sins." Jeremy nodded, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Come up to my office with me, and tell me what you need to say." He shooed Joseph and the others who offered to help, and slowly made his way back to the office with the boy, closing the door firmly behind him. A few minutes later, Jeremy stuck his head out and asked for a large lunch for 2 to be sent up. It was nearly half an hour after that before Jeremy asked for Wes to join them in the office. An hour later, and Cooper watched through the binoculars as the church bell rang and people began to gather outside. He cursed as he packed up his binoculars and began to run north, putting as many miles between him and the small town as he could. He ran for the backwoods, where cars and horses alike would have difficulty following. He was gone, long before Armando, surrounded by well-armed militia, led the townspeople to the camp he and Armando had made the evening before. Armando stared into the distance. The stark, dead trees that populated Reelfoot Lake stood in the far distance. He knew Cooper wouldn't be back, no matter what he had threatened. The priest, no, not a priest, they called him Reverend here, had told him he would be safe and that no matter what he had done, God would forgive him if he only asked. Armando wasn't so sure about that last part, but he made a silent promise to his mother that he would do his best to earn that forgiveness. The Reverend's wife had been kind as well. Heavily pregnant and awkward with her big belly, she had still found a place for him to sleep for the night there in the sanctuary. Most of the children the makeshift orphanage had housed were now living with foster or adoptive parents. The large room was still filled with beds, but it was mostly empty. Miss Grace had explained that she knew someone very special who was looking for a child to take in. She patted his shoulder. "You'll like Abby. She's raised 2 kids of her own and just has Tabitha still at home. She's got room and I've told her all about you." Within a few weeks, Armando had shortened his name to Andy and fit in seamlessly with the Carters. He missed his mother, more than he could even say, but for the first time in his life, he finally felt safe. Miles to the west, Scott Cooper walked on.